There are things a man carries that he never speaks out loud. Not because he's ashamed. Not exactly. But because some truths are so heavy, so quietly devastating, that the moment you say them, really say them, they become real in a way you can never take back. I've been carrying this one for a long time, and I've been trying to figure out the right way to begin, the right word, the right moment. But I've come to understand there is no right moment for a story like this. You just start. So, let me start here with the feeling, not the facts. The feeling. It felt like being erased. Slowly. The way a pencil drawing gets rubbed out. Not all at once, but edge by edge, line by line. Until one morning, you look in the mirror, and you think, who is that? Is that still me? That's where I need you to begin with me. Not at the beginning of the story, but at the beginning of the pain. Because that's where the truth lives. I remember the morning clearly. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because of what didn't happen. It was a Tuesday. I remember that specifically, because Tuesdays were always quiet in our house. My son, Richard, he had his standing breakfast meeting at the office every Tuesday. Early. Gone by 6:30. So the house was always mine on Tuesday mornings. Coffee. The old leather chair by the window. The sound of birds outside that I'd learned to name over the years. Because my wife, God rest her, she used to make me learn them with her. That one's a mockingbird, Larry. Listen, really listen. I always smiled when I thought of that. She had this way of making me pay attention to things I would have walked past my entire life. Anyway, that Tuesday morning, I walked past Richard's study. His door was open. Slightly. Just enough. And I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't. I was just walking to the kitchen. But something made me stop. Not a sound. Not a smell. Just a feeling. You know that feeling. The kind that lives somewhere between your shoulder blades. That quiet tightening. That your body registers before your brain is even caught up. I stopped. I looked through the gap in the door. And there it was. On his desk. A folder. Light brown. Thick with papers. And on top of those papers, a yellow sticky note. I couldn't read all of it from where I was standing. But I could read 4 words. 4 words. And I stood there. In my socks. In the hallway of the house I built. With my own 2 hands. And I felt something drain out of me. Like warm water out of a bathtub. Slow. Then fast. Then gone. Those 4 words. I won't tell you what they were yet. Because I need you to understand. Who I was before that moment. Who we were. Before I can explain what those words meant. When I finally understood them. My name is Larry. Larry Peter. And I am not a remarkable man. I've never pretended to be. I grew up in a small town. The kind of town where everyone knows your father's name before they know yours. My father was a carpenter. His hands were rough as bark, and twice as strong. He didn't say much, but everything he built lasted. I learned from that. Not carpentry, exactly, though I know my way around a workshop. But the philosophy. Build things that last. Don't waste materials. Don't cut corners. Do it right the first time. I applied that to everything. My work. My marriage. My family. I spent 32 years working in construction management. Started as a site foreman. When I was 24, retired as a regional director. Not because I was the smartest man in the room, but because I showed up. Every single day. I showed up. My wife, Patricia. Patty, I called her. She used to say, "Larry, you're the most stubborn man alive." But she always said it, while she was smiling. We were married for 38 years. 38 years. We had 2 children, Richard and Diane. Richard was the older one, by 4 years. He was sharp, ambitious, had this quality even as a boy. This need to calculate things. Every decision had to make sense. On paper, every relationship had to have a function. I used to think that was just how he was wired. I used to be proud of it, even. My son, the thinker. Diane was different. Softer. The kind of person who called just to check in. Who remembered birthdays. Who drove 3 hours one Christmas. Just to make sure I wasn't alone. After Patty passed, she didn't have much money. She never did. But she had presence. That's the word. She had presence. Now, when Patty got sick, and this is important, this is where things began a shift. It was Richard who stepped in first. He offered to manage the finances, the medical bills, the insurance claims, the paperwork, and I was grateful. Genuinely. Because grief makes you small. It shrinks you. It takes the man you were and turns him into something that can barely tie his own shoes. Some mornings. So when Richard sat me down and said, "Dad, let me handle this. You don't need the stress." I said, "Yes." Of course I said yes. He was my son. I trusted him. The way you trust your own heartbeat. Without thinking. Without question. What a terrible thing. To trust someone. Without question. The thing about betrayal. And I've had time to think about this. A lot of time. Is that it rarely announces itself. It doesn't knock on your door. It doesn't send you a warning. It just settles in. Like damp in the walls. You don't see it. Not at first. You feel it maybe. On particularly cold mornings. But you tell yourself it's nothing. You tell yourself the house is just old. You've lived here long enough. You know its sounds. You know its rhythms. And so the damp just spreads. That's what was happening. In the years after Patty died. The damp was spreading. And I was telling myself, the house was just old. The first thing I noticed was the meetings. Richard started having what he called estate planning conversations, which sounds reasonable, responsible even. But the meetings were always at his house, never mine. And there was always a man there, named Gerald. Gerald wore glasses and had the kind of handshake that doesn't commit to anything. Richard introduced him as our family advisor. Our. Like that word was a done thing. Like I'd signed something. I hadn't signed anything. But I remember nodding. Smiling. Because I was 71 years old. And my wife was 6 months in the ground. And I just wanted one thing in my life. To not be complicated. I signed papers. I'm not proud of that. I signed papers I didn't fully read. Because Richard sat across from me. And he had his mother's eyes. I've always said that. And I kept thinking, he's a good boy. He's taking care of things. Patty would be proud. What a thing to think. What a desperately wrong thing to think. After the meeting stopped, the distance started. And I want you to understand what I mean by distance. Because it wasn't cold. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't dramatic. That's the thing people don't tell you about being slowly pushed aside. It's polite. It's polished. It arrives on a Sunday, in the form of a canceled dinner. Dad, Richard's got a thing with work. Can we reschedule? Yes. Of course. It arrives on a Wednesday. When you call, and the phone rings 4 times before going to voicemail, and he calls back. He does. Just not until the evening, and the conversation is short, not unkind, just short. It arrives in December, when the Christmas gathering moves from my house, where it had been for over 20 years, to Richard's new home in the suburbs. More space, Dad. The kids have room to run around. You don't need all that hassle. I stood in my kitchen that Christmas Eve, with a turkey I'd already bought, already seasoned, already ready, and I sat down at the table, and I ate alone. I told myself it was fine. People change. Families evolve. Children grow up and build their own worlds. And that is what you raise them to do. That is the success. So I sat there with my turkey and my empty table, and I told myself I was proud. But the thing about lying to yourself is that your body knows. Your body always knows. I couldn't finish the meal. I sat there for a long time, just sitting, just listening to the quiet. And somewhere underneath the quiet, I could hear Patty's voice, like it was coming from far away. Pay attention, Larry. Really listen. I need to tell you about Diane now, because Diane is the part of this story that keeps me from falling apart. When I tell it, after Patty died, Diane called me every Sunday, without fail, without exception, even when she was working double shifts. At the hospital, she's a nurse, has been for 15 years. She still called. Sometimes it was short, just checking in, Dad. You eat today. You get outside. But sometimes we talked for hours. She'd tell me about her patients, not by name, just by story. There was this old man today, Dad. Reminded me of you. He kept asking the nurses if anyone had called, and she'd pause when she said that. The kind of pause that holds more weight than any words around it. I knew what she was telling me. I knew. She visited when she could, which wasn't often. She lived 4 hours away, and money was always tight. But when she came with food. Real food. Not takeout. She'd cook, standing in my kitchen, in her old clothes, moving the way her mother used to move, humming the same songs her mother used to hum. And I'd sit at the counter and watch her, and feel something I can only describe as saved. Not fixed. Not healed. But saved from the worst of it. Just for a few days. Now, the thing about Diane is that she had questions, where Richard never questioned. Diane always questioned. She asked me once. This was maybe 1.5 years after Patty passed. She asked me quietly, not accusingly, just quietly, Dad, do you know what's happening with the estate? I said, Richard's handling it. She nodded slowly, looked at her hands, then looked up at me. Has he shown you anything? Any documents? Any updates? I opened my mouth to say yes, and then I stopped, because the honest answer was, no, not really. There'd been papers. There'd been folders. There'd been Jer, with his non-committal handshake. But show me anything in a way I understood. explained anything in plain language. No. I said, "He's got it handled, Diane. You know how Richard is." She said, "I know exactly how Richard is." And then she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. And I let it go. I shouldn't have let it go, but I did. Because you want to believe in the people you love. You want to believe more than you want to know the truth. And that is the most human thing about all of this. I'm going to pause here for just a moment, because if you've made it this far, if this story is sitting inside you in a way that feels familiar, I want to say something to you directly. You've probably known someone like me. Or maybe you've been someone like me. Someone who trusted too easily. Someone who confused loyalty with blindness. Someone who sat at a Christmas table, alone, and told themselves it was fine. If that's you, I'm not here to tell you you were foolish. I'm here to tell you you were human. And this story, this is for you. Not just for the drama of it, but for the truth inside it. If it's already touching something in you, I'd ask you to hit that subscribe button. Not because of an algorithm, but because stories like this one deserve to be heard. And people like you deserve to know they're not alone in what they've carried. All right, let me go back, because we're not done yet. Not even close. Back to that Tuesday morning. Back to that hallway. Back to those 4 words. I stood there for a moment longer. Then I pushed the door open. Slowly. The way you open a door. When some part of you already doesn't want to see what's on the other side. I walked to the desk. I picked up the sticky note. And I read the whole thing. It said, "Before the old man figures it out, get Gerald to file the amendment." That was it. That was all it said. But you have to understand what happened inside me when I read those words. It wasn't rage. Not at first. It was cold. A cold that started somewhere behind my sternum and spread outward, slowly, through my ribs, into my arms, down into my hands. I put the note back down, exactly where it was. I walked back to the kitchen. I sat down in the leather chair, and I looked out the window, at the birds in the garden that Patty taught me to name. And I thought, the old man, he meant me. He was talking about me. His father. Before the old man figures it out. I sat in that chair for a very long time. I didn't move. I didn't call anyone. I just sat and let those words work through me. The way venom works through you. Slow, but thorough. I need to tell you something about the house. Because the house matters. It matters to this story. In a way that won't make sense yet. But will. I built this house. Not metaphorically. Literally. I designed it. I sourced the materials. I managed the build. I was 41 years old. Patty was pregnant with Diane. Richard was 4. And I remember standing on the lot, the day before the foundation was poured, and just looking at the dirt, the future, the thing that wasn't yet. And I made a promise to myself, and to whatever was listening. This house will outlast me. Everything I put into it will outlast me. And over the years it became everything. Birthday parties, Christmases, Richard's first broken bone, in the backyard, Diane's prom photos, on the porch steps, Patty's garden, her roses, her ridiculous, beautiful, overflowing roses that I pretended to hate, taking care of, but secretly loved, because they were hers. After Patty died, I stayed. Of course I stayed. This was her place. This was our place. The walls held everything. Every argument we'd ever had and recovered from. Every laugh. Every night she fell asleep on my shoulder, watching television. And I'd sit there, perfectly still, refusing to move. Because I didn't want to wake her. I didn't want to lose that moment. That ordinary, sacred, irreplaceable moment. I was going to leave the house to both of them. That was always the plan. Richard and Diane. Equal shares. That was what Patty and I had agreed. That was what I believed was still in place. But Gerald had been busy. Hadn't he? I want to be careful here. Because what I did next was not something I'm entirely proud of. But I also won't pretend. I didn't do it. I am 73 years old. I have earned the right to be honest about the things I've done. I called Diane. That evening, I called her, and I said, "Diane, I need your help." I don't say that often. I've said it maybe 4 times in my life. She knew immediately that something was wrong. "Dad, what happened?" I told her about the note, word for word. I heard her go quiet on the other end. That particular silence, that isn't emptiness. It's fullness. Too full to speak. She said, "Dad, I need you to do something. And I need you to trust me." I said, "You're the only one I do trust." She told me to find a solicitor. Not a family friend. Not someone Richard knew. A completely independent solicitor. She gave me a name. A woman named Carol. She said, "Carol helped a woman at my hospital. Similar situation. She's straight, she's good. Don't tell Richard." I hung up the phone, and I sat with that last part. Don't tell Richard. There was a time that instruction would have felt impossible. Disloyal. Wrong. Now it felt like survival. I called Carol the next morning. Carol had an office above a dry cleaner's on the high street. Small. Practical. Smelled like old paper and strong coffee. I liked her immediately. She was in her mid-50s. No nonsense. The kind of person who listens with her whole face. I told her everything. The meetings. The papers. Gerald. The sticky note. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me 3 questions. First, do you have any copies of the original will? Yes. Patty and I had both kept copies. Mine was in the filing cabinet, in the study, behind the utility bills, where it had always been. Second, have you signed anything in the last 2 years that you didn't fully understand? I paused, longer than I wanted to. Yes, I had. Several things. At those Tuesday meetings. With Gerald. Third, does your son know the contents of your personal will? And here is where I want to pause and breathe. Because this was the question. That changed everything. My personal will. Not Patty's. Mine. The one I had quietly updated. 6 months after she passed. The one that Richard didn't know about. The one I had written. In the private grief of a Tuesday evening. When the house was too quiet. And I needed to feel like I still had some control over something. I told Carol, "No, he doesn't know what's in it." She looked at me, and for the first time in months, I saw something on someone's face that I hadn't seen in a long time. Respect, not pity. Respect, she said. Then Mr. Peter. I think you may have more power than either of you realize. I drove home from Carol's office in a kind of silence I can't quite explain. Not the silence of grief. Not the silence of emptiness. Something different. The silence of a man who has been asleep and is now slowly waking up. And waking up hurts. I'm not going to lie to you about that. Because when you love someone, really love them, the bone-deep kind, the kind that forms over decades, finding out they've been working against you doesn't feel like anger. Not at first. It feels like grief. A specific kind of grief. The grief of realizing that the version of Richard I had been holding in my heart all these years didn't exist. Not completely. Maybe not at all. The boy who used to bring me drawings from school. The teenager I coached through his first heartbreak. The man who stood beside me at Patty's funeral and held my arm and said, "I've got you, Dad." Did he mean that? Any of it? Or was he already calculating? I thought about Patty's eyes. His eyes. The ones I kept seeing when I looked at him. And I thought, maybe that was the cruelest part. That I'd spent 2 years forgiving him things before I even knew he'd done them. Because he had her eyes. And I missed her so much. So desperately, completely, ruinously much. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. Just sitting, watching the roses. Pay attention, Larry. I know, Patty. I know. He came 3 days later. Unannounced. Which was unusual. He usually sent a message. Confirmed. Scheduled. Richard didn't do spontaneous. So when I heard the knock at the door, that firm, 3-beat knock that was always his, something tightened in my chest. I let him in. I made tea. That's what you do. You make tea. You perform normalcy. While everything underneath is anything but. He sat at the kitchen table. He looked polished as always. Navy suit. No tie. That half-relaxed look. That people in his world practice. In mirrors. He asked how I was doing. I said fine. He said the garden looked good. I said Diane had helped me with it. Last month. Something moved across his face then. Subtle. Barely there. But I caught it. Something tightened. Just for a second. Then the smile returned. He said, "I wanted to talk to you. About some updates. Estate things. Nothing alarming. Just housekeeping." I said, "What kind of housekeeping?" He had a folder with him. He put it on the table. And I looked at that folder. And I thought of the other folder. The one in his study. The yellow note on top. Before the old man figures it out. I didn't reach for it. I let him open it. He began explaining. Words like restructuring. And efficiency. And protecting the asset. Every sentence designed to sound responsible. To sound like love. I let him talk. I sat across from him. And I looked at his face. And I listened. The way Patty taught me to listen. Really listen. Not to the words. To the spaces between the words. And what I heard, in all those spaces, was this. He thinks I'll sign again. He thinks I don't know. He thinks the old man will just nod along. When he finished, he slid the folder across to me. I looked at it. I picked it up. I placed it back down. And then I looked at him. Really looked at him. And I said, very quietly, "Richard, I'm not going to sign this." The table went very still. Everything went very still. He blinked. Once. "Dad." "No," I said. "I'm not going to sign it. And I think you know why." He looked at me for a long moment, and something happened in his face that I hadn't expected. Not anger. Not calculation. Something much closer, too. Fear. I want to say something here. About power. Because I think we misunderstand it. We think power is loud. We think power is the raised voice, the slammed door, the dramatic exit. But real power is quiet. It's sitting across a table from someone who believed they were in control and watching the moment. They realize they aren't. It doesn't require anger. It doesn't require cruelty. It just requires knowing. And I knew. I knew about the amendment. I knew about Gerald. I knew about the folder in his study. And most importantly, most powerfully, he didn't know what I knew. And he didn't know what was in my will. I didn't reveal all of this in that moment. I just said, very calmly, "I've been speaking with a solicitor. My own. Independently." I watched him recalibrate. I watched him reach for something to say. He found, "Dad, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There hasn't been," I said. "But I'm not angry with you. I want you to know that. I'm not angry." And the extraordinary thing was, I meant it. Not because what he did wasn't wrong. It was deeply, profoundly wrong. But anger takes something from you. When you direct it at your own child, even a child who has betrayed you, there's a grief in that anger. That swallows you whole, if you're not careful. So I chose something else. I chose clarity. He left that evening, without the signed folder. He left quieter than he arrived. And I stood at the window and watched his car reverse out of the drive. And I thought, it's not over, but something has shifted, and it will never shift back. I called Diane that night. She picked up on the first ring. I told her what happened. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, are you okay?" Not, "That's great." Not, "You showed him." Just, "Are you okay?" I've thought about that a lot. In the month since. The difference between those responses. The first two are about the event. The third is about the person. Diane always led with the person. That's who she is. I told her I was okay. That I didn't quite feel triumphant. That I felt tired mostly. And sad. A very specific kind of sad. That I couldn't name then. But I can name now. It's the sadness of seeing someone clearly. For the first time. And realizing that the image you've carried doesn't match the reality. And knowing you can never go back to the version of them you used to love so simply. She listened to all of that. She said, "He's still your son. And this doesn't have to end everything. But it has to change things." I said, "I know." She said, "The will, Dad. When are you going to tell him about the will?" I said, "When the time is right." She said, "Don't wait too long. I want to be careful here. Because I'm not telling you this for drama. I'm not telling you this for revenge. I'm telling you this because it's part of the truth. And the truth is the whole point. When I updated my will, 6 months after Patty died, I made several decisions. The house, my house, the one I built, I left in a trust. A specific kind of trust, managed by an independent body. Neither Richard nor Diane would own it outright, but the terms of the trust provided for it to be maintained. As a family home. For as long as anyone in the family needed it. Diane's children could live there. Richard's children could stay there. But no one could sell it. No one could restructure it. No one could quietly redirect its value into their own accounts. The financial assets. The pension. The savings. The proceeds from Patty's life insurance. I split those differently than Richard expected. 60% to Diane. 40% to Richard. Not as punishment, but as recognition. Diane had spent 15 years building a life of service on a nurse's salary. She had shown up every Sunday, every Christmas, every moment that mattered. She hadn't asked for anything. And Richard had spent 2 years, assuming the inheritance was already his, already decided, already arranged. He had not shown up. He had shown up for the folder, for the meetings, for Gerald, but not for me, not for the turkey at Christmas, that nobody came to eat, not for the chair by the window, where I sat alone, and listened to birds I didn't want to name anymore, because naming them felt too much like talking to her, and not having her answer. Beyond the financial, there was a letter, a personal letter. I wrote to each of them. Richard's letter was honest, not cruel, not dramatic, just honest. It said, I know what you tried to do. I know you thought I wouldn't notice. I know you thought I was too old, too tired, too grief-struck to see clearly. I forgive you, not because it wasn't wrong, but because you are my son, and I refuse to leave this world, carrying hatred for my own child. But I need you to understand that love and trust are not the same thing. I love you. I do not trust you. And you made that true. Not me. It wasn't dramatic. That's the thing about real life. The most important moments rarely are. Carol contacted Richard's solicitor with the documentation, the original will, the trust structure, the amendment I had filed. That superseded anything Gerald had arranged. I wasn't there for that meeting. I was in my garden. Patty's roses. It was late afternoon. The light was doing that thing it does. At that hour in autumn, where it turns everything. A kind of amber. That makes even ordinary things look like they're worth preserving. My phone rang. It was Richard. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. He didn't say hello. He said, Dad. Just that. Just my name. Dad. In a voice I hadn't heard. Since he was a boy. Since the night before he started secondary school. And he came into my room. And sat at the edge of the bed. And said he was scared. I'd forgotten he had that voice. That underneath all the calculation. And the polish. And the ambition. He had that voice. I said, Hello, Richard. He said, I didn't know you knew. I said, I know. Long silence. I'm sorry, Dad. And here is where I want to slow down. Because this is the moment that everything else has been building toward. And it wasn't what I expected. I had imagined this moment sometimes. In the months between finding the note and this phone call, I had imagined I'd feel vindicated, restored, maybe even a little cold. But I didn't feel any of that. I felt sad, deeply, quietly sad, because the son who was apologizing was also the son I had once held, in my arms, in a hospital room, on a rainy Wednesday morning, 38 years ago, when he was 4 hours old, and I had looked at that face, that tiny, enormous, impossible face, and felt something I had no words for. had never had words for. I still don't. I said, I know you're sorry. He said, is it too late? For us? And I looked at the roses, at the amber light, at the garden I'd built, because she loved it. And I thought about what Patty would say. I thought, she would not tell me to close the door. She would tell me to leave it open. But she would tell me, to make sure, I could see clearly. Through it. I said, it's not too late. But things have to change. Real things. Not words. Actions. Over time. He said, I understand. We hung up. And I stood in the garden. For a long time after. Just standing. Just breathing. Letting the amber light do what it does. Diane came the following weekend. She brought soup. Of course she brought soup. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table. Where Richard had placed his folder. Not long before. And we talked for hours. She asked me how I was feeling. Not about the legal situation. Not about the outcome. Just how I was feeling. I told her the truth. I said, I feel like I've been through something. I can't quite name yet. Like I've come out the other side of something. But I haven't figured out what to call it. She nodded. She said, some things don't need names right away. Just give it time. I said, I owe you. She shook her head. You don't owe me anything. That's not why I showed up. I showed up because you're my dad. It was never about the will. I believed her. That's the thing. I believed her completely. Without a second of doubt. And I thought about what a rare thing that was. To believe someone. Without a second of doubt. To trust someone. That completely. She stayed for 4 days. We cooked together. We watched television. We went for walks in the park nearby. And she made me name the birds again. That one's a mockingbird, Dad. Remember? Mom used to make you name them. I said, I remember everything she made me do. Diane smiled. Good. Don't stop. It didn't fix overnight. I want to be honest about that. It doesn't. Families don't fix overnight. They repair. The way old buildings repair. Slowly. Carefully. With the right materials. Applied over time. By people who are willing to do the work. Richard called more often. He didn't immediately become the son I'd imagined. But he called. He came to Christmas. He came without an agenda. He sat at my table. My table. In my house. And he was quieter. More careful. Less polished. At one point over dinner, he looked at Diane. And then he looked at me. And he said, I'm glad this house is still ours. All of us. And I believe he meant it. Not all apologies come in words. Some of them come in a person. Sitting at your table. At Christmas. With their children. Who are running through the halls. Of the house you built. With your own 2 hands. 4 decades ago. Some apologies come in presents. In choosing to show up. When you didn't before. I'll take that. Not blindly. But I'll take it. Spring came. The way spring always comes. Gradually. Then suddenly. Then gloriously. Patty's roses came back. They always come back. Every year. Without fail. No matter how bad the winter was. I stood at the back door one morning. In my dressing gown. With my coffee. And I looked at them. Coming through. Bright. Insistent. Refusing to not exist. And I thought, that's it. That's the thing. You don't stop coming through, even after the worst winter, even after everything. You come through. I am 73 years old. I have buried my wife. I have watched my son become a stranger. And then, slowly, become something approaching himself again. I have sat alone at Christmas tables. I have held sticky notes and shaking hands. I have sat across from solicitors, in offices above dry cleaners, and reclaimed something I almost let slip away. And I am still here, coming through, like the roses. If you're still here, if you've made it all the way to the end of this, then I think you already understand what I'm about to say. You cannot control what other people do with the trust you give them. You cannot take back the love you already spent, but you can choose what you do with what you know. You can choose to see clearly, to act quietly, to forgive without forgetting, to protect yourself without becoming someone you wouldn't recognize. That's what I learned. Not from a book, not from a seminar, from a yellow sticky note, from a rose garden in the spring, from a daughter who called every Sunday, from a wife who taught me to listen to the birds. I didn't know I had power until I stopped believing I'd lost it. That's the whole thing. That's all of it. Pay attention. Really listen. You're still here. And that matters more than they thought it did. End of story.